You're listening to Big World Network.
Bloodshot Buck, Episode 12, Part 2. Written by W.H. Wood and Mitch K. Allan. Read by Willow Wood. Neni felt vaguely aware of her lifeless body behind her, tumbling into Ark. On the edge of her hearing, Potts shrieked at them both, but she couldn't make out the words.
No ears,
she thought.
no anything.
Just blood.
Fuck Arkadash and Potts, both of them, all of them. I'll strangle everyone.
She just wanted to leave. Why wouldn't they let her leave? But she'd like to see them try and stop her now. She longed for them to try shooting at her perfect, liquid, monstrous, unbound body. Just try it. Hara's mouth formed a four-letter word as Neni's blood form rose up. The Justicate's hands went to her chest, fingers closing around the hilt of her own Anishim knife. Neni got there first. Free from the bounds of muscle and skeleton, she crossed the distance between them in two huge strides. Her bloody fist caved Hara's chest plate in and sent her sprawling across the gleaming floor. Neni felt, rather than heard, Arkadash and Potts scuttle behind her, trying to make a break for the shuttle. With a flick of her hand, she drew a wisp of blood from Arkadash's shoulder wound, ignoring his grunt. She sent the droplets screaming down the bay, knocking the firing squad's weapons to the floor. Most of them shrieked in agony as the droplets ripped a hole clean through the backs of their hands. No time to check on Ark or the boy. The 5 Justicates spread out before her, each with an Anishim knife in hand. She would have to trust that she had done enough to give them both a clear run to the ship. They'd been in her way this whole time. This careful plan had been collapsing around her ears all night, because Tristan Potts couldn't keep his hands to himself, and Arkadash never knew when to fucking quit. And Shing, and Gimbal, and now! Could she take out 5 Justicates? Simultaneously? Arkadash might pass out if she stole any more blood from him, and Hara, kneeling on the floor and cradling her stomach, still hadn't so much as cut her cheek.
You're forgetting you're the super synth,
Neni told herself.
Your mutation is perfect.
When it came to the blood form, no one could match Neni's transformation for sheer speed. These guys could take up to a minute to reform into human shape. More than enough time to sprint after Arkadash. And what if they did try to stop her? She could rip them to shreds. She was going to rip them to shreds. All this time waiting and sitting back and listening to endless plans, and now Neni had to do it herself. It all came down to doing the job herself. Neni pumped her liquid arms and raced across the bay, past the Justicates who finally made their move. 5 chattering consciousnesses burst into her head, tugging and pushing. The Justicates surged around her body, swimming through her veins, hissing and passing messages to each other. Her elbows seized up, and her knees as they pulled her backwards. Slick, red feet squeaked along the floor. "Shut up! Shut up!" Neni shrieked, recoiling from the mental hooks they drove into her joints, slowly dragging her down. She stumbled once and pushed on. They were no match, clinging to her mind as she dragged herself ceaselessly towards the shuttle. She was actually doing it. She was fighting off 5 of them. 5 at once.
I'm going to make it.
Arkadash was pushing little Potts through the shuttle door now. All he had to do was jump on and start up the ignition sequence. They were getting out of here. They were getting out. Neni crashed to the ground, her blood sucked against the floor tiles as an invisible force pressed down and reduced her to a puzzle. Every droplet and atom of her new body vibrated and ached of justicate, of meddling, of horror.
Get off!
Nice try, Prout. Hara wheezed, still clutching her belly. Neni struggled against her hold, now just a squelchy mess on the floor. Hara kept pushing, forcing her blood form to compact and shrink into a dense shape. But Neni only had eyes for John, stupid, cold, proud John, who hadn't had an original thought in years. I tried so hard to trust you, Prout, Hara began, walking towards her. I even stood up for you during our last meeting, despite my better judgment. Of course, my better judgment would have been scorned anyways. Can't say a bad word about you, can we?
Oh my God, even when I'm dying I can't escape your pointless monologues.
Any blood at all, any sliver of a weapon she could use right now. The Justicates had all been so careful not to get so much as a scratch on themselves. The security guards had been ordered out of the room as soon as they were hit. Potts and Ark were safe inside the shuttle. She could feel their pulsing bodies, wrapped up in fleshiness she couldn't penetrate.
Don't use Ark,
Neni's remaining rational side pleaded. But what other option was there? Neni the super synth, Hara said, and Lord, was she still going. There, on the other side of the bay. One of the firing squad, lingering by the exit and still bleeding from a torn artery in his hand. Perfect. Neni struggled in Hara's grip, reaching out mentally as far as she could, squeezing that drop into her grasp. Just one drop. She tried to blur her intentions from Hara by thinking about stabbing the woman's thighs. All Hara had to do was pin Neni down long enough for her consciousness to slip away. Dry up. Gone.
I can't believe it's come down to this,
John said. The sound reached Neni crystal clear, where all other noise had turned fuzzy without her real ears. Slow, gentle pressure built above her, forcing her further against the tiles, spreading her out into a thin layer of liquid. He was in her head. He was in her head, and so was Hara, and no! There was no privacy, no separation or distinction between minds. Pressing and struggling against Neni meant entering the very static of her being.
And how dare you think you've got a right to help Hara like this? I looked up to you,
John said, pressing down firmly on her squashy form.
But Hara always said you'd go back to Mars.
Just reach, just tease that one blob out from particles of dust and dead skin.
Come to Mama.
I thought we could rely on you, Neni. Me! Neni screamed back at him, flopping uselessly on the floor.
What about you?
For a moment, she saw herself through his eyes, a helpless splooge, a dark smear.
Some super synth you are,
he said. Neni froze as the droplet of blood slid from the guard's hand, and she pushed what remained of her will into controlling it.
I beg your fucking pardon,
she replied. He wasn't pitying her. He was smug. And they were both pushing down on her now, him and Hara, and she knew with cold certainty that Hara had heard every word.
Get out!
Neni threw the pellet of blood across the shuttle bay, tightening and sharpening until it shot through John's neck. John's eyes widened and he clutched his throat, but Neni was already there, in every vein, in every ventricle of his heart, tugging and pulling. She drained his lifeblood from the puncture wound on his neck and collected it in a dark pool, hanging in the air like a drone. Prout! Hara screamed, horror evident in those high cliff cheekbones. The shock made her concentration lapse, and the pressure on Neni lifted, just enough for her to break free. Not letting go of John's struggling, distorted shape, Nenni rose up to her full height again. She felt jagged sparks race throughout her malformed limbs and winced. Being pinned down and meddled with for so long made her blood cells sticky and confused. Keeping John aloft across the docking bay didn't help matters. His shriveled body collapsed. If she didn't let him remorph into his human shape within the next 2 minutes, his consciousness would pass out, and he'd die. If she accidentally dropped more than a cupful of his blood, the shock would also kill him, akin to having one's limbs ripped off, apparently. "Nenni," Hara said, her voice ragged, but lowering her tone. "Think about this." Nenni walked backwards, slowly, dragging the gory sphere along with her. The docking bay doors hissed open, displaying ranks of synths and justices. Back up. Nobody moved, all eyes on one red woman and the ball of blood. Hara's hands flew up, fingers splayed outwards. "You're going to put him back," she said. "This is a hostage thing, I get that." Nenni felt her back muscles start to reappear, and her calves. Soon stringy tendons would attach themselves to milky bones. Throwing all that blood around, and now she had no time. A gentle push teased against her blood body, testing for weaknesses, desperate not to be noticed. In response, Nenni flicked a fingerworth of John's blood across the room. It landed across Hara's stunned eyes with a splat.
"Try that again,"
Nenni thrummed.
"and I'll drop him."
"What?" Hara spluttered.
"What?"
John's faint consciousness echoed.
"I can't fight you and carry him,"
Nenni said.
"It's one or the other."
It was only 5 more steps. 4. The engine thrummed now, ready to go. Nenni swore she could smell Pot's sandy, irritating hair.
"Nenni!"
John begged.
"Are you crazy?"
"Prout! You listening to me?" Hara barked. Nenni nodded her gooey head, trying to ignore the cartilage forming into the shape of her nose. 3.
"Nenni, don't drop me, please. You can go. She'll let you go. NENI-LOHI, come on."
2.
"Nenni, Nenni, Nenni, Nenni! Oh my God, shut up!"
He was worse than Potts.
"Hey, look!"
he said, his voice stronger now. For a moment, he was the same boy who had giggled with her in classes years ago, his ceaseless carelessness floating back.
"We can sort this out. It doesn't have to be like this."
Nenni tried to tell him it did. She wanted to believe him, but there was no other option. But he filled her senses, interrupted her, talked over her.
"Things will go back to the way they were. We can go to Earth. It was just a blip, Nenni. They'll understand. You don't have to go down for this. You're too important for demolition. Remember that time we threw water balloons out of our residential block?"
"Yeah," Nenni heard herself reply, a low murmur under his constant chatter.
"We got our asses handed to us."
100 other memories bombarded her. Every time they ever did anything together, every meal they cooked, every program they'd watched together, all that messing about during their synth training. He threw everything he had at her.
"John, stop. Just don't drop me. You're manipulating me. Don't drop me!"
The images started distorting, playing backwards, skipping parts. Things that were never said, bits that didn't happen, began to bleed through.
"John!"
Nenni said.
"Stop! Prout, I am telling you, don't you dare!"
But no one could tell her what not to dare.
"My name isn't Prout!"
She shrieked back. Nenni threw what was left of John against the floor, a concentrated burst of howling, struggling justice, now just sticky, congealing blood, and dived through the shuttle's open door. She saw Potts trying to strap himself into the long seat against the right wall, but as soon as she entered, the buckles fell from his fingers. He turned white and started breathing hard enough to take off, trembling at the sight of her. Arkadash sat in one of the pilot seats, twisted around to watch for Neni's docking, and also did nothing but stare. Neni's rage turned to panic, turned to rage again. "Go!" She tried to yell, but it came out as a bubbling, ragged roar. It did the trick. Arkadash whipped around and hit something that made the door close. The shuttle lurched forward and Neni fell to her knees, gripping the seats for support. Potts yelled, wedging into the corner, so desperate to get away from her that he clung to the seatbelt rather than strapped himself in. The vibrating shuttle shot spasms of pain throughout Neni's remorphing body, and she felt a gelatinous skin grow around her liquid limbs, cocooning her. With all the strength she had left, Neni crawled to the tiny washroom in the corner. Her fingers slipped and flubbered over the handle. The shuttle lurched forward. Unable to save herself, the force sent Neni slamming into the rear wall. She hit the surface with a splat, and her transparent cocoon split all up her right side. Blood dribbled down to the floor. She had to get into the washroom before the final burst of speed.
"Maximum velocity in 5,
Arkadash began.
Come on, Lohi.
3.
Shouting out, her vocal cords finally sounding human, Neni dived at the door, wrenched it open, and threw herself into the corner. Oh God, her lungs were starting to grow. She focused on every pained, ragged breath. So dizzy, so blind.
2.
She felt the shower drain vaguely beneath one hand and clawed her fingers into it.
1.
The pressure increased. The shuttle roared. Blood squeezed out her split side.
We're away.
Silence.
Neni. We're out.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.
You're listening to Big World Network.